To avoid wasting time, I'm just gonna say this right off the bat. No, I do not think Dark Souls should have an easy mode, and I don't necessarily think a game is better because it's more accessible. If you are a player that makes use of these kinds of modes or thinks Dark Souls would benefit from one, I implore you to stay because it is you who I want to talk to. Not for you to change your mind about what mode you play, but for you to maybe understand a little more about why people such as myself take this kind of stance. But before I dive into that, there's one particular argument that I need to address first, or else a good chunk of you will be thinking it throughout the entire video. And that argument is, why do you even care? Why can't you just play the game the way you want to play it and let others play the way they want to play? Who are you to tell others how to play their games, and easy mode would not affect you personally? Now, even if that was true, which it's not, and I'll explain why in a bit, but even if it was, this is a stupid argument, stop using it. Yes, I care about other people's opinions and how they play their games. So do many other people. So do you. The people who don't care are not on the internet right now. They're playing their games. Trying to convince people to play Halo 3 because you thought it was a good game is not much different than me wanting people to play a certain mode because I think it delivers the best experience. There are many things in this video you'll be able to question and argue against. My reason for caring should not be one of them. So again, stop. Anyways, this video is a bit of a response to two other fantastic videos. Should Dark Souls have an easy mode? And what makes Celeste's assist mode special? Both done by the talented YouTuber Mark Brown. If you have the time, I do suggest that you watch one, if not both, as unlike my videos, they are extremely informative and entertaining. But either way, I'll be summarizing his points, so if you can't, then don't worry about it. In these videos, especially the first one, Mark Brown tackles the very controversial question of whether or not Dark Souls should have an easy mode. He identifies that the difficulty is a fundamental part of the experience that the developers intend for the player to have. A mode without this difficulty would lack the core of what the game's all about, and any player who chose that mode at the beginning would rob themselves of experiencing the very best the game had to offer. Despite this, Mark Brown comes to the conclusion that when dealing with difficulty modes, it's all about communication. As long as the developers are able to communicate to the player that a lower difficulty mode is not the intended experience, then no harm is being done. He uses Celeste as a prime example of how to do this. The game directs players to the intended experience without barring them off from an alternative. So even though he never explicitly says it, the essence of his argument is that if Dark Souls had a separate mode, not necessarily an easy mode, but a lower difficulty mode nonetheless, it would be fine as long as the developers made it absolutely clear that this mode was not the way the game was intended to be played, and was only there for those who truly felt they needed it. Although this is a very noble and thought out perspective, it is one that I strongly disagree with. I feel like the notion that nothing about the Dark Souls experience would be lost with the inclusion of a separate mode shows a lack of understanding of what the Dark Souls experience even is. Now, maybe I'm not equipped to make this claim. My experience with the Souls series is limited to about 10 hours of my own gameplay, mixed with many more hours of watching my friends play. Even so, I feel confident saying that Dark Souls is by no means the most difficult game on the market. It's not even close. I implore you to pick up a copy of the Catherine remake, throw it on hard, and see how quickly you want to bash your head through the TV. But of course, the difference here is that Catherine has difficulty modes, and the second you find yourself struggling, nothing is stopping you from throwing it all the way down to easy. But in Dark Souls, you have no such option. Even if there are ways to make the game easier on yourself, you're still required to have a fairly high level of skill in order to make progress. And if you're not at that skill level, you're not playing Dark Souls. So then, that is where the argument starts. Clearly, I don't have enough skill to play this game, so therefore the game is inaccessible to me. By adding an easier mode, they would then be making the game accessible, and nothing would change because all those other people who are good enough at the game would just play on the normal difficulty settings. Now, for someone to say something like this implies that they have a very narrow outlook on the gaming community, as if in this community there are people who are good at certain games and people who aren't, and we all just popped out the womb like this, as if every player right now who is playing and enjoying the Souls series was already good enough at Souls when they first picked it up, and every player who wasn't has been forever banished from the experience. I don't know if you know, but majority of the people who are now fans of Souls sucked at Souls. A large chunk of those people did not realize that they enjoyed the difficulty until they were given their trial of fire with the series. There are tons and tons of stories about people discovering a newfound love for that soul-crushing hardship because they weren't given the option to avoid it. And that's what makes Souls special. The Dark Souls experience isn't that it's a hard game, it's that it's a hard game without any alternative. Either you learn to overcome those hardships or you don't. Either you succeed or you don't. Dark Souls doesn't change for you, you change for Dark Souls. The whole welcome to Dark Souls meme wouldn't even exist if the game had options to change the difficulty, because that goes against its character. The rules of that world don't bend to the player's will, and the game will treat you the same no matter who you are. As much as this is a joke, there's a lot of truth to it. The reason why you'll see it as the go-to response is because it's how everyone else had to do it. That's what makes Dark Souls what it is. To say that nothing would change with an easy mode would be to say that all of these people who were initially struggling wouldn't have turned down the difficulty if they were given the chance, regardless of whether or not the developers labeled it as a lesser experience. Are you honestly going to try and tell me that this wouldn't have made majority of the current fanbase turn down the difficulty? I'm pretty confident in saying that minus a few specific cases, 99.9% of people who regularly play games have the ability to learn a game as hard as Dark Souls. Does everyone have the patience to do so? No. This is especially true when we're given an easy alternative, because as human beings, we won't hesitate to take the path of least resistance. But for Dark Souls, the only alternative you have is not to play the game. So people who struggle are a lot more likely to push onward because they have no choice but to do so. Yes, that difficulty will become a barrier that pushes away a lot of potential fans. But for those who stay, the games do something invaluable. They change people. Dark Souls didn't just sell itself to people who liked hard games. It created fans of hard games. Let's do a quick example. These numbers aren't based on anything, they're just here to make a point. But let's say that 10,000 people were interested in buying the first Dark Souls game. I know that Demon's Souls was the first Souls game, but I'm trying not to confuse people here. Out of those 10,000 people, 8,000 of them were interested in the game's aesthetic. Things like the art style, the music, and the world building. They could care less about the game's difficulty because they had never played a brutally hard game before. 2,000 of those people were interested in the game because it was hard, and despite their liking for the game's aesthetic, the difficulty was part of the selling point for them. Now, if Dark Souls had an easier mode, then those 8,000 people would have taken advantage of that mode instead of exerting themselves, and the 2,000 people who were fine with the difficulty would just play on the regular settings. But that's not how it went down, because Dark Souls does not have an easy mode. So in reality, it probably went more like this: 8,000 people interested in the game's aesthetic, 2,000 people interested in the difficulty. Out of those 8,000 people, 5,000 of them were driven away because they hated how hard it was, and they felt it wasn't worth their time to try and push through. The other 3,000 people decided it was worth their time to push through, and in the end, they got the full experience and enjoyed it. Now, yes, this might look like a worse off scenario because there's 5,000 less people part of the community, but the value of those 3,000 people staying and getting the Dark Souls experience is immeasurable, because now there are 3,000 more people in the world who potentially became fans of brutally hard games. Fans in the market that did not exist beforehand. And with every entry in the series, this number continued to grow and grow and grow. This is why Dark Souls has had such an insanely strong impact on the community. This is why everyone and their mom wants to get compared to Dark Souls. It's the Dark Souls of this, it's the Dark Souls of that. Even games that aren't even thematically similar still get the comparison if they have any level of difficulty, because they know that because of Dark Souls, there are now a lot more people who are interested in hard games compared to 7 years ago. If the series had an easy mode, then yes, it would have become more accessible, but if that happened, then that initial number of people who were comfortable playing a brutally hard game would not have increased to the ridiculous size that it is now. Again, Dark Souls was by no means the hardest game on the market, but it was the only one that forced the difficulty on every player, and in doing so, was able to create its own trend instead of selling to an existing one. This is why, despite its sales being nothing but a drop in the bucket compared to other heavy hitters years in the industry, it has still become one of the most influential series of all time. Games like Cuphead and Nioh would not exist if it wasn't for Dark Souls having such an impact on the market. And the influence goes beyond just the obvious examples, as its design philosophies can be seen popping up everywhere. It's impossible to tell just how far its influence has reached, but it's very hard to imagine a game like Breath of the Wild, a Nintendo game, getting made in a market without Dark Souls. The game isn't very difficult, but it's not afraid to let the player learn from death if they make a mistake. The amount of things in this game that will kill you quickly or will kill you in one shot is ridiculous, and is a far cry to any game Nintendo has made in the past decade. Dark Souls being an unapologetically hard game is a unique situation, but it is just a spark that lights a much broader conversation that's not necessarily about difficulty, but about accessibility and intended experiences. Like Mark Brown, I believe it's ultimately up to the designers as to whether or not they want to include these kinds of settings. Dark Souls is just a rare case where it's very, very clear that the entire game is built around its soul-crushing difficulty. There are many games out there that have multiple difficulty modes that don't screw with the game's main concepts and ideas. The question is, at what point does it become don't play the game mode? If you somehow made it through that slog of a video, and maybe by some miracle you actually enjoyed it to some extent, then maybe consider supporting me on Patreon so I can do this kind of stuff more often. Thank you to those who donated this month, and special thanks to these top donators: Ginger Groove, Blind Man, and Alexis Ubri Penzo. I don't know what I'm doing. A little tired. You know what I'm tired of though? I'm tired of the Grand Exchange. And